good. I can hear myself. Right, so I like this picture. What I did, I found this picture. It's a brilliant artist called Brooke Shadem. And this picture is basically reminiscent to me of, you know, being lost at sea. So like complex PTSD or anxiety or trauma, we can feel very lost at sea, but somehow we've still got a light inside of us. And this picture reminds me of, you know, how lost we can be and how lost we can feel in the world and in society, because at the end of the day, we're trying to heal, but a lot of people don't understand what's going on when people have been through trauma and the reality of being through trauma. In spirituality and such, people will think that we can just let it go. If people have been abused by parents, then the strong suggestion out there is that we just let it go. In spiritual terms, we hand it over to a higher power or God. The problem is that when we are babies and children, we're sponges. So what happens is that we take everything in and then we direct that in on ourselves. So our self-care system becomes very distorted, and the distortion means that we don't know how to deal with life. So I heard Gabon Mate, a gentleman who works on trauma and addiction, he's on YouTube, speaking the other day, and the reality that we have is that if you get angry with a child and because they've done something, then you're upset that they're crying, then what they're going to do is turn that in, and they're not going to express their feelings. So we've been through, many of us have been through childhood, maybe sexual abuse or physical abuse and verbal abuse, spiritual abuse, and we've not been able to voice it. So as we squash that down and pretend that it's not there, when we get into adulthood and we begin to look back and remember these events, we keep replaying them in our minds, and we can also be triggered by things that don't make sense to us. Like it could be a smell, it could be the way somebody speaks to us, a tone of voice, or somebody reminds us of somebody that's been abusive to us. So it's not an easy path coming out the other end of trauma. But I do think that we're very, you know, blessed in a way that to be coming up to 2020, you know, if we go back 30 years ago, you know, I was 22, 30 years ago, I was 22, 23. And even beyond that, people didn't talk about things. You couldn't talk about the fact if you'd had sexual abuse or you'd been traumatized by your parents, you would have had to keep quiet. We're coming into a period of time now where people are speaking up about trauma, which means that the verbal ventilation of it and it being in the public also domain where people are speaking about trauma, we're able to get to the grips of the reality of it individually. So I'm going to do a little bit of reading, and I've got a few slides to show you as well. So anxiety disorders, and we've got generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a response, and also complex PTSD. And they differ, you know. I've heard that the generalized anxiety disorder is really to do with the future. We're worried about something in the now or the future. Social anxiety, again, is a bit different. We're afraid of, you know, hanging out around human beings. And then post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, would generally be a one-off event. And that's not downplaying it, because veterans have been through PTSD. Complex PTSD goes into the complexities of maybe things that we suffered as in childhood, and many hundreds of events for many of us. So it's not just one thing, it's like this big mix. So this is why it's complex. So I got to the point where I understood that even though I was in pain emotionally, and, you know, which goes into physical then, because the body is affected by our mind. When we're going through trauma and anxiety and fears, the cortisol levels go really high, and then we get ailments in our body, you know, autoimmune stuff and things like that. So it's very beneficial to us that we get conscious about the fact that we've been traumatized, we have got an issue, but we're going to need to heal it. So, and that means that we have to stop disassociating. And here's an idea that if we dedicate ourselves to conscious healing and with our anxiety, and recognize how we have been affected, and then we decide individually to solve it and move forward from the painful experiences, then life will get better. So healing is not all or nothing. It's not like one day you wake up and it's gone. It's not like you know, a wound that you cut your hand and then 3 or 4 weeks later you're healed from it. Healing from trauma is 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and that can really put people back. And if we're trying to disassociate, maybe stop drinking or stop smoking or something like that. I used to do both those things. I don't do them anymore. But if we get to a point where we're trying to stop doing that, and then we have a bad day, we might, you know, some might go and have a drink. I used to do that, or go and have a cigarette or whatever, and or maybe eat, you know, something that you don't really want to eat. It's just that you're under anxiety. So it has a huge knock-on effect, different things that happen to us in our lives. It's like harder to heal. So when we stop disassociating and we get conscious that I'm going to heal, I've got an issue and I'm going to heal this, then that's we're halfway there, because then we can begin to grieve and we can begin to healthy anger and we can have healthy blame, and we get rid of the toxic shame and we begin to deal with our inner critic. So then if we look at narcissistic abuse, basically narcissism really flies around on YouTube and such like. I remember when I first started healing years ago, I was looking at narcissism and, you know, over the top on it, to be honest with you, that, you know, it's a word that's thrown around and probably not really understood. But the simplistic term of narcissism is where people got more self-interest than they have in other human beings. So if I hurt you, for instance, I'm a narcissist and I don't care, and it's about me, that, you know, and I'm gonna, if you don't like it, then then you get blamed. So this is what happens with narcissism. So if we've had narcissistic parents, they wouldn't have had any empathy. They would have had a lack of empathy, and their treatment, they wouldn't have looked at the way they were treating us. They would have just treated us however they treated us. So it also, we get mental and physical harm is inflicted by it's where people are severely self-centered, and whether people realize that they're that self-centered and cruel, who knows? I mean, you know, I know when I'm having a bad day, and if I'm a bit snappy with somebody or rude to somebody, I know that I'm rude, and I will, you know, correct that under the correct circumstances. I will correct it if I'm a bit grumpy with somebody. But people who've got narcissism in them, we all have to some degree, but when there's a huge level of it, it just means that people just are not aware and they don't care about how it affects another human being. So abuse in childhood parenting this is what it does. So the child abuse, bad parenting can cause anxiety, feelings of being unworthy of love, and you can feel neglected. And these have a knock-on effects as we go into adulthood, because when we start making choices, be it our job, our partners, or whatever we get into, or, you know, dating, it means that we don't see the little red flags that come up. So we've, you know, we might see something and we just don't call somebody out on it, or we'll just, you know, let them off the hook, when really we should be a bit more, have a bit better boundaries, like having good, healthy boundaries. And it takes time to learn that, because if we weren't treated properly as children, then we don't know what healthy boundaries are. We just think that the way we were treated is normal. So if somebody comes along and they're a bit of an ass to us, we think that's normal, when it's not. So then we've got that as children, we internalize and then externalize hurt feelings when we're bullied or exposed by, you know, abuse of power. Then we basically internalize it. And that's what children do, because they can't speak up, because they can't, you know, decide to get up and I'm leaving home. Children have to, you know, put up with their parents and just go along with however they're treating us. We don't even understand what's going on. We just, you know, get on with it. And this causes depression, and it can cause anxiety, and it causes ultimately low self-esteem, and it leads to CPTSD, complex PTSD. So we can begin to look at how we respond and begin to heal that by understanding the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, which I'm going to go through a little bit in a little while. In brief, they're called the 4 Fs in Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And then the other thing we want to take on board is that we want to look at, and this isn't about punishing ourselves or toxic shaming or blaming ourselves. We want to truly look at where we're disassociating. So if there's any substance abuse, you know, where with food or sexual activity or anything that we do, you know, for instance, I'll give you an example. We can use social media in a healthy way, that we're doing something healthy, or we can use it where we're just disassociating, and people can do it with computer games, all sorts of different things. So we need to, you know, monitor ourselves and look at ourselves and say, hey, you know, what is this? Am I happy that I'm living this way? And again, it's a process, so we can't do everything overnight, but there are ideas to take on. These are ideas to take on board. The other thing is we need to look around us to make sure that if we've got any narcissistic characters around us, whether that be family or at work or our friends, we need to really look at that and stop interacting with those people if they are, because they will affect our health and our mental health and our emotional health, and the body reacts to mistreatment. So any ailments that we have will be far worse. You know, they're just going to escalate if we are hanging around people who are being abusive to us, even if it's subtle abuse, that or something that's not working for us or making us unhappy. So also a narcissistic parent or family member in childhood is tragic to a child. I mean, you can imagine like mistreating anybody is, and doing it continuously and on a constant basis is tragic for a child, because a child does not have a choice. But clearly, if we've had that all the way through our childhood, then we're going to replicate that in our adult relationships, not in its totality, but we will to a degree. Abusers generally, unfortunately, are toxic, and many of them willfully abuse others by telling them, but they'll tell you that there's something wrong with you. So you can see maybe in childhood where you were told, you know, there was something wrong with you or you weren't loved. And that's very difficult for us. So what I'm going to do now is show you another slide. Something Carl Gustav Jung said. If you don't know who Carl Gustav Jung is, he was born in 1875 and he was the founder of psychoanalysis along with Freud. And Carl Gustav Jung was 20 years younger than Freud. A lot of more people know the name, Freud's name, and there's a reason for that, because Freud and Carl Jung fell out. They had very difference in opinions, and they had different ways of believing and doing things, which affected the name of Carl Gustav Jung at the time. But Carl Jung's work now is becoming very popular because it's really written for our time, and that is the truth of his work, which is he was way ahead of the game. His work was written for the time that we are in now, which is hard to explain in a sentence. But he says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So as we make the unconscious our patterns of childhood and we bring them into our consciousness, they'll stop directing our lives. They won't have, you know, a detrimental effect on us. But again, it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight. So reading on here, we've got thoughts as triggers, and thoughts can be very triggering in extremely rejecting families. The child eventually comes to believe that even her or his normal needs, preferences, feelings, and boundaries are dangerous imperfections. So if you consider that, this is Pete Walker saying this from his book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. He points out that when we're abused, that our normal needs, preferences, and feelings, and boundaries, we think they are imperfections, because we think that if we need something because we're mistreated, that there's something wrong with us. And that then we think that we are, you know, punishment and abandonment are justifiable, that because we're not good. And this is not true. So sometimes we might get into relations where we're having these problems with people, but we think that we're not worthy, and we think that we deserve to be punished or abandoned, or we think that we might be. So we don't express ourselves fully with the people that love us. So it's a double-edged sword. So where parents also use children's words as ammunition against them, the mere impulse to speak sometimes triggers intense feelings of panic. So I've experienced this particularly where I was told that, you know, I should really be over anything that went on that I experienced as a child. So as an adult, I got to a point where the people that, you know, where I had parenting, I still don't feel comfortable to have a conversation or speak up, because I've got that same feeling that I had as a child in me. And that's a very hard pattern to break, and it's very triggering. So there's intense feelings of panic and fear, but you're not acting from the place of an adult. you're going back to that childhood reaction that you had, and that loop is very difficult to break, because it will take, you know, a conscious parent to, you know, have a discussion with you in order to break that pattern, and the parent would have to have also included, if they've abused you, to stop having abused you and owned up to their own stuff as well, and, you know, say what needs to be said in order to remedy the situation. And a lot of parents that have been abusive to their children are either in complete denial that it didn't happen, or they just can't face the fear of facing it themselves. So the problems never get resolved, and they get passed from family to family, and that is a nightmare in society. So I'm very grateful for the people out there who are speaking up and, you know, doing it gracefully, because it's going to help, you know, the millions and millions of people that are suffering one by one. So he goes on to say, how could anything the child says not reveal his stupidity and worthlessness? So, you know, if you were made to feel stupid for being in pain as a child, as an adult, you're going to do the same thing. You're not going to tell people that you're in pain or in need when you need to. And there also can be feelings that you're going to be rejected if you tell people that you've had a hard time as a child, and this stops people from going to get the help that they need. So we do need communities that are speaking up on this, and thankfully, thank God for social media and Facebook, because some of the groups out there are some outstanding groups on social media that address anxiety and CPTSD and child abuse. So also, as ongoing neglect and abuse repetitively strengthen the critics, even the most innocuous self-interested thought or musing can trigger a fire alarm or an intense emotional flashback. So the problems are with abuse is the emotional flashbacks and triggers, and it's very hard for people that have not been through abuse to understand what somebody's going through at that point. And also, we can maintain the elusive hopes of someday winning parental approval. So there can be ideas that, you know, if we get over it and we forgive them, that, you know, we're going to win approval, and it causes a lot of anxiety, which you know, escalates and may even get to a point where we become obsessive compulsive and think that we have to be perfect. And I've experienced that myself. You know, I was never perfect enough, never good enough. So, and social media can exacerbate that as well, because when we see people, we think people have got it more together than we have. But when it boils down to reality, you know, everybody's got an imprint of some sort that's really uncomfortable, and bits about themselves that they don't like. So we're quite human. And that bit there, with some of my commentary, not all of it that I read, was Pete Walker, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. In a minute, I'm going to read about intimacy and the outer critic, but I'm going to show you another slide here. So a brief run through. I'm not going to stay long on this slide. What we have is avoid what PTSD or complex PTSD looks like, and it's not a complete list of what it looks like, but it's an idea. We can avoid thinking of the trauma initially. We can have flashbacks. We cannot concentrate. There's negative thinking about oneself and about the future. There's sleeping difficulties, feelings of guilt and shame, negative moods. You're always on guard or hypervigilant in case, you know, you just don't feel safe. And loss of interest and bad dreams as well can occur with people with CPTSD. Next slide. I will say this is called Maslow's Hierarchy of Human Needs. You can find this on the internet, but basically what we do need, as our basic needs are at the bottom of this long triangle, is shelter, clean air, food, water, and sleep. So our physical needs. And if we look at the world, there are parts of the world that don't have shelter, clean air, clean air or food or water, fresh water, and they haven't got anywhere to sleep. So, depending on where we live, we've got different situations going on all over the world. But people do need that. We need shelter, clean air, food, water, and sleep. And that's our physical. Then secondly, we need security, love and belonging. We need security of employment. We need family, health, morality, resources, and property to live in. We don't have to own it, but we need somewhere to live, all of us. And the third one going up the scale here is we need safety. So we need friendship, family responsibility, and we have social needs, all of us. The next one is esteem. So confidence, achievement, respect of others, as well, and that's esteem. And then finally, when we've got those things, we're able to contribute into society. So we, contributing with morality, we creativity, spontaneity, problem solving, and lack of prejudice. So we can see how problems are caused by people not having one or two of these needs not met. And if they're not met in childhood, then it's it's a real struggle going through adulthood. Okay, so this is the book I'm reading from. I'm going to continue reading a bit more. I suggest you look at the links below my video, and you're going to see Pete Walker's book in one of the links. You're going to see 13 steps for managing flashbacks in below the video as well in the links. And you're also going to see 14 steps for managing your inner critic. So the most important thing is with complex PTSD, which most people don't know, is that the first thing that we need to tackle is the inner critic. And the inner critic is the voice that's not ours, that's annihilating us. So now I'm going to read a bit from his book, which is Intimacy and the Outer Critic. So Pete Walker says, complex PTSD typically includes an attachment disorder, which arises from childhood experience of not having at least one caretaker safe enough to go to for comfort or help. When the developing child lacks a supportive parental refuge, she or he never learns that interrelating can soothe and metabolize confusions, conflicts, and hurts. So you can see that if we're being abused, it doesn't have to be a parent, it can be a carer, or it can be bullying at school, or any of these situations that are long-term. If we've got no one to go to soothe us, soothe our confusions, conflicts, and hurts, you can see what a nightmare that turns out to be turning into an adult. It's really hard. So also, he says, she or he also never learns that real intimacy grows out of sharing all of one's experiences, the good and the bad, the happy and the sad, the loving and the mad. To the degree we are vulnerable and authentic in relationship, that degree do we experience the incomparable healing power of intimacy. So a lot of people who've been through abuse will cut themselves off from other people. I've certainly done that myself. And what I'm trying to do now is integrate myself back into, for 10 years or longer, I shut myself off from people and just worked and used to have a bottle of wine. And then I stopped doing that. And then I began to sort of get into groups on Facebook and stuff like that. But I had a very bad experience in 2014, 15 and 16 through social media, which was very damaging to me. It put me into a flashback that led to a loss of my business that I'd had for 30 years. So we have to watch out that there is, whatever we call it, there are characters that maybe are not intentionally untoward, but they're just not conscious enough to understand how their behavior will affect another human being, and they're not prepared to look at themselves. So we need to make sure people that we're getting involved with on social media have some decency about them, and we take our time to get to know people and don't just give all of our trust away all at once. Trust is built. We don't just we can generally trust human beings, but when we're getting intimate in friendship, we need to know that we can trust people. And clearly we're going to get our fingers burnt sometimes because of the nature of life. Pete Walker goes on to say, however, to the degree that our caretakers attack or shame or abandon us for showing vulnerability, to that degree do we later avoid the authentic self-expression fundamental to intimacy. Inclinations to verbalize feelings, ask for help, or reveal one's struggles are short-circuited by subliminal memories of being scorned or attacked for daring to seek out the parent's support. Even worse, retaliation fantasies can plague us for hours and days on the occasions we do show our vulnerabilities. He says here, I once experienced this after being very honest and vulnerable in a job interview with a committee of 8. Over the next 3 nights, insomnia plagued nights, my critic ran non-stop films featuring my interviewers, who subsequently hired me, contempt about everything I had said. So he had self-contempt about everything he said and disgust about what he had left out. So we can, I've said to myself sometimes when I started speaking up, when I tell somebody, I was sexually abused, I felt so embarrassed and so ashamed, because then I would worry about what people would think about me. And when we think how ridiculous that is, that we're put into toxic shame over something that we did not do, that happened to us. You know, if somebody had a car accident, for instance, and they said they had a car accident, we wouldn't start shaming and toxic shaming them and blaming them. We would support them. So we can see how cockeyed the world is when it comes to trauma. You know, people want to shut it away. If there is anybody there also that wants to chat, I can see, I'm just testing this works. Test. I put a test there. So if anybody does want to say anything to me, do feel free as I'm talking. I'll check as I'm reading this. So the next bit I want to read is about self-esteem. So self-esteem refers to how you feel about yourself overall, how much esteem, positive regard or self-love you have. Self-esteem develops from experiences and situations that have shaped how you view yourself today. So we have a lot of work to do on our self-esteem, because if we were trodden on and mistreated and told horrible things about ourselves, then our self-esteem is going to be pretty awful. So we need to work on that, and we need to be accepting and loving of ourselves. And this is inner critic work. So the inner critic list is below this video. The difference between self-esteem, I was trying to look on Wikipedia for this, but you know, really understand the difference between self-esteem and self-confidence. So self-confidence is how you feel about your abilities and can vary from situation to situation. So I may have healthy self-esteem, but low self-confidence about situations involving maths, for example. This is what I wrote. So for me, you know, I used to have, I didn't used to feel self-confident about making YouTubes a couple of years ago, but now I have the self-confidence to do that. And my self-esteem, though, is a bit, you know, 50-50 sometimes. Sometimes, oh, I'm, you know, thinking that I'm not going to look right or something like that. So we can see that self-esteem and self-confidence are different things. And that as we get to learn to love ourselves and our inner child, which was not loved, then our self-esteem will begin to improve. So I don't want to just say to people out there, oh, you just got to love yourself, learn to love yourself, because this is, you know, the only way that we're going to do that is by getting rid of the inner critic. You know, you can't bypass the inner critic. You can't ignore it. You have to really begin to look at that voice that's coming in and saying horrible things to you. One of the regular things I heard as a child growing up was, what's wrong with you, child? So despite the fact that I was being abused, I was at the same time I was being asked what's wrong with me. I mean, and you think that if you know, clearly you can see the unconsciousness of the parenting there to, you know that abuse is going on to some varying degree, and then ask a child what's wrong with it. It just seems a bit strange to me. But clearly the more I've looked at complex PTSD and worked with others on this, then I, you know, beginning to really see it in the cold light of day, what's going on. So I wouldn't say, so it's not just love yourself, it's like really inner critic work. So get that list below, you know, go to that link and print it off and, you know, fold it up, put it in your bag or your wallet and pull it out when you need it and look at it and read it till you actually understand it. And then we start embodying it and we start knocking the inner critic out of the way. So for instance, that voice that says, oh, what's wrong with you, child? I'll go, bush, out of the way. That's an example. Or swear at it, you know, and eventually it will begin to taper off. The other thing we have, when we are confident in areas of our lives, also when we have this self-love and we've got, as we're getting rid of this inner critic, then we'll begin to have self-confidence about ourselves, and then our overall sense of self-esteem will begin to rise. And we can work with both of these things at the same time. A little bit more about embracing the inner critic. So the inner critic work is embracing the critic, in my experience, he says, Pete Walker, until the fight response is substantially restored. I'm going to read that again. Embracing the critic, in my experience, until the fight response is substantially restored, the average complex PTSD client benefits little more from the refined and rational techniques of embracing, dialoguing with, and interrelating with the parts of sufficiently shrunken critic. An important part of latter recovery work, well described in the excellent book, Embracing the Inner Critic by Stone and Stone, The Soul Without Shame by Brown, which is a book, he says. Once again, however, these left brain objective approaches are very limited to us until it's backed up by a subjective right brain stance of aggressive self-protection. So what we're doing is we're working with the inner child. Like, you imagine you've got an inner child inside of you, like a 4-year-old, 5-year-old. Your inner critic comes in, which is that voice in your head, which was given to you, which is not your voice. And we need to protect that inner child inside of us from that voice with fierce ferocity. We need to be a warrior. We need to be a hero for that inner child, because we didn't have heroes. So we need to be the hero for our own inner child and not allow the, that monster of a voice that was not ours to annihilate the inner child. He says here, perhaps this is because the inner critic appears to align with the extreme right brain dominance of flashbacks. And this can be seen, he says here, in MRI scans, that it can be seen how this works. Perhaps inner critic processes are so emotionally charged that the dominant and unremunerated efforts to resist them rationally fail. So we've got to do that work, the inner critic work, otherwise we're not going to evolve this. Yeah. So let's see if I've got any more slides here. This is a really pretty picture. Somebody, lovely lady in my ladies group. If you're a lady, I've got a ladies group on Facebook called Anxiety and Complex PTSD Free, I think it's called. You can find me over on Facebook. Ladies to join. I do that because of the nature of the abuse that I went through, which, was more sticking with ladies on that is just more comfortable discussing that. But there are groups for men also on complex PTSD that you can find on Facebook. So this is where we've got to learn to give yourself time, give ourselves time. So, you can see there the caterpillar, and then it goes into the chrysalis here, and then it becomes the beautiful butterfly. And that does not happen overnight. And when that butterfly leaves that cocoon, it is painful. Okay. If you've ever seen one, I've seen a few videos of that taking place, and it's not an easy transition, but we can transmute. We can go from the caterpillar that was suffering, being a caterpillar, not being able to fly, to being bound up in our pain and our wound, and then to spreading our wings and being free. Okay. So it's a beautiful picture. And this is my last one. For fun, know your worth and then add tax. Okay. So we've really got to know our worth. And then as we know our worth, then that means when we start valuing ourselves inside, then we're going to start attracting different people into our lives. So this isn't foolproof. Sometimes, no matter how much we value ourselves, we're still going to come across people who are a bit strange or a bit, unkind, but we're going to have the capacity to basically say no when we mean no. And we're going to be able to draw the line and know what's right. And we will not let narcissistic, or unkind people into our arena. We'll say, no, I'm not having that. Okay. And the beauty of that is as well, then we'll start attracting people who are, decent and conscious. And those people might come and go. There might be people that come in and stay for a longer time in our lives, and people who might come in for a short period of time, but generally they will be people that were adding and life-giving rather than life-depleting to us. So let's see, that's it. I'm going to stop share.